I imagine that when you get into a car with Tom Zoellner and head for the open road, he will know exactly where he's going. He will work with his car's idiosyncratic sputters and mind the places along the highways and byways and lead you to stories about people and places you'd never otherwise experience. This is exactly what we experience in reading Tom Zoellner's latest book, The National Road: Dispatches from a Changing America. This is Book Public from Texas Public Radio. I'm Yvette Benavides. Buckle up. When you read Tom Zoellner's essays, you'll feel like you're on the road, or wish you were. The hidden secret histories of people and places here will reveal a complicated landscape, divided by politics and faith, shaped by racial, social, and economic disparity. One nation, sometimes divisible, sometimes beautiful, always mysterious. I talked to Tom Zoellner about his book, The National Road. The book is called The National Road: Dispatches from a Changing America. So as I read the book, I kept thinking about the things that were changing. It's a key piece of this book for me. And we see change described and depicted in all kinds of ways. As you've included this as the subtitle of the book, something that basically describes for readers what they're about to walk into. And this is a huge question, right, with a huge answer. But can you talk about this idea of change, maybe even generally as part of your motivation for pulling these essays together for this collection?
Sure. Broadly speaking, there's two forces for enormous change that are slow moving but inexorable. The first is the internet. It's really hard to overstate the sociological impact this amorphous reality in our lives has had in terms of destroying once solid industries. The one that hits me the hardest is, of course, the newspaper business, which has been absolutely decimated by online news reporting and the consequent degeneration of certain information sources. The second force is income inequality, which is actually related to the internet in this way that those people who work in certain industries, such as financial services, such as information, such as data, such as e-commerce, they become liberated from geography. They can live anywhere. They do business in the cloud, so to speak. Whereas those who work in other industries, such as manufacturing, retail, mining, healthcare, geography remains an anchor. So broadly speaking, the book as a whole is about geography, about American geography and the ways that it is both broadened but also frightfully limited by the forces of inequality and the internet.
Well, some of your topics in this collection move to rather esoteric places. I mean, even though they're not totally obscure subjects, they're a little bit off the beaten path for some of us who do not have the experience of traveling that you do. And so you really open up all of these vistas for us. And even though they're obscure to us, you do such a good job of contextualizing them and helping us understand the background. But I just had to wonder, Tom, like, how did you choose these subjects? I mean, I never considered really Joseph Smith, for example. So I was wondering, how do you find these sort of pet projects? And it feels like you've just immersed yourself in these places and these people that you write about.
Well, first of all, thank you for that nice compliment, and I also agree with you about the esoterica that's in this book. It does nerd out a certain amount. And you mentioned Joseph Smith, the founding prophet of the Mormon Church. I'm not a Mormon. I'm not a Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which is the formal name. But nevertheless, there's something about that faith which has baptized the American continent in a kind of sacredness, according to their theology. And I find that just marvelously fascinating. And the essay to which you refer involves petty trespassing that I did, not deliberately, but just sort of I would get to these places after nightfall, these historic sites that are important to the Mormon Church. And, the gates were closed, the visitor center was closed, but I still wanted to see it. So I would just go over the fence. And, something about those experiences, which, we're not precisely supernatural, but still it gets to the question of the worship urge that I thought was important. And so your question about was, how did I choose these topics? These topics sort of chose me. And I realized, maybe a couple of years into this, that they all were connected with the thread of geography.
Well, you described this really interesting supernatural thing that occurred when you were out there that night. You heard the sounds of like some kind of angelic choir. What happened out there? I mean, it really just goes to show every single time that, as we say in nonfiction, you can't make this stuff up. When you put yourself out there in the world, things happen. And you recorded those things, and it makes such a great story.
Thank you. Yeah, the incident to which you're referring happened in the Vermont woods, on a snowy night. This was when I was in graduate school, and I had gone to a party where there were some law students, and there was some beer drinking going on, and so not excessively, not that would have prevented me from driving home. And on the way home, I saw a highway sign that said "Birthplace of Joseph Smith, 2 miles," with an arrow pointing up the hill. And I thought, you know what, I'm going. So I went up there and parked my truck, as I said, outside the gates, realizing, oh, they're closed. Of course they're closed. It's like, almost midnight, on a snowy night. There's no way they're going to be open. But you know what? I really want to go in there. So I went over the fence. And as you said, yeah, there was this angelic singing coming from the dark woods, which that's rather unusual. And, it caused maybe 2 minutes of thinking, what have I walked into, or what's happening? And before I realized, they had left the Christmas Carol tape on all night long. And so, they're playing "Hark the Herald Angels Sing" to nobody in the middle of the woods at this historic site. And, it created a moment of, kind of being freaked out.
Well, you mentioned that you are not of this faith, but when I read the essay, I came away with this feeling this is part of the American landscape that you're introducing us to. And then I was looking at Joseph Smith and thinking about how you offer him up as a person to be admired, even. What is it that you admire about him?
Well, first of all, he was an enormously gifted storyteller. And the Book of Mormon is really hard to read. It's turgid, but it contains the seeds of a marvelous spiritual imagination. And so I agree with you that the sort of title of the essay, which is "Mormon Historic Sites at Night," might be off-putting, that we're just not going to want to read about something that's, of a different faith, or if we don't have any faith, that we don't want to read about it at all. But, I'm a believer in religious literacy, that, just being a part of a good citizen is sort of having a basic kind of knowledge about what different faiths happen to believe in, sort of a non-judgmental approach to their theology, that we should all have kind of a knowledge of the basic tenets of Islam, of Buddhism, of Hinduism. And, Mormonism certainly fits into that schema, particularly when it comes to the United States, which is the cradle of the religion.
Well, the payoff was great. I mean, it was a great essay, and I learned so much. And of course, the story, your own storytelling, sort of merged with what we learned about Joseph Smith, was just wonderful. We learn a little bit more about you in the essay Drive. You do something I think a lot of us wouldn't do in 2021, frankly, and maybe some of us couldn't do it. But you used to sleep in your car a lot. So when you mentioned the parking lot at this place where you heard the choir, I thought of many parking lots where you've had to sleep. So I'm just wondering, like, when was the last time you did that? That could not have been too recent. That you would sleep in your car.
Exactly. Yeah, and I haven't gone anywhere since the pandemic
Sure.
descended. But yeah, that's still sort of a habit. And you're right that perhaps I do enjoy a certain privilege in doing it. But tonight, even in the midst of the pandemic, there's going to be tens of thousands of people sleeping in their cars. This is
Sure.
a feature of economic inequality. It's not pleasant, but it's real. There's a nomadic culture out there. I might even draw a comparison to hobo culture of the Depression era, where people would jump on board freight trains to go to the next, agricultural job.
Mm-hmm.
We've got that today. It's more vehicle based, but you can find encampments of homeless people sleeping in, certainly not very affluent looking RVs,
Mm-hmm.
and in their cars. And, I did it when I was a little more poor, just to save
Mm-hmm.
$50 on a motel. And those listeners who have done it, know that, yeah, it can be uncomfortable, but, you find ways to sort of make it comfortable.
Yes, and I like all of the suggestions and the good advice, just in case, about in between the lights, or not in too uh, dark or distant a spot within the lot. So that's I thought about that. Well, you never know; it may come up. You just never know in this
Yeah,
life.
yeah, yeah. If I could pass on church parking lots
Yeah.
on any night but a Saturday night, because you're going to get Sunday morning parishioners maybe, calling the cops on you. But they typically make very good places to sleep.
The other thing we learned about you is that you love to drive, and while you live out this idea about, Americans' love affair with the automobile. The whole thing is really less about the car for you than just the idea of moving and certainly of driving, but not the car. I know a lot of people who treat their cars like, I don't know, like extensions of themselves, like the wash and the wax and the detailing as just as a matter of routine in their lives. But your point is really different. A car is merely utilitarian. You don't even have to know too much about what's under the hood. It's you make a car work for you, and you make these excursions. I just really appreciated that, because I feel like people, I don't know, like this treating the car like something to polish up and show off. I've just never been into that. So it was just something about this utilitarian purpose for the automobile, and that was it, that I really appreciated.
Yeah, well, I agree with you about it. I don't see cars as fetish objects. That's not to disrespect those who do. I just don't share that interest. It's the
Mm.
same way that, what I would like from a computer is to be able to turn it on and, save a Microsoft Word document or send an email, and really that's about it.
Mhm.
It's sort of a means to an end. Not a thing to be sort of worshipped on its own.
You mentioned earlier this idea of the internet and how that's one of these big features of change. And it made me think about the same attention you don't pay to the exterior of a car, you do not pay to GPS. And you have like this thing for the Rand McNally Road Atlas. And there's like a level of disdain that you harbor for people that rely on the GPS. Haven't you ever been in a situation where the GPS kind of saved your trip for you?
Absolutely. And
Okay.
yeah, I'm not a purist. I will just, along with the best of them, look at my phone while driving, which is not a great idea, but I still do it. Yeah, that's to say that I have a nostalgia for the paper map, which I think gives you a kind of a panorama on the landscape that taps something kind of ancient, or at least since cartography became a democratized thing, maybe around the time of the printing press. But
Oh,
there's just something about holding it in your hands, the tactile quality of it.
yeah. Reading that part, yeah, I felt almost a sense of longing for just a regular old map. And just the way that you described that you have to be driving when you're looking at it. um, so all of that was, yeah, I think I did look at that with a certain amount of nostalgia.
Yeah, I mean, with a map, you have to maintain a certain presence of mind. You
Mm-hmm.
have to orient yourself in terms of the cardinal directions. You have to sort of pay attention to the streets you're passing. Whereas we all know with a phone, you can just almost put yourself on autopilot and just be guided there, almost like a railroad track, and that's no fun.
And I think people forget it wasn't that long ago. That's all we had. That's all we really had. So it was
Yeah,
nice
it
to read
required
about
a
the
conversance with the landscape.
yeah.
Where I live in Los Angeles, there used to be this encyclopedia-sized publication called the Thomas Guide, which would tell you, which was, a map of every paved street in, Los Angeles and Orange counties, which,
Wow.
I have one of the very last ones to be printed in 2011. It's a massive thing that everyone used to have to kind of put on their laps and sort of understand where they were. And I think people understood Los Angeles a lot better with having to go through
Hmm.
that rather than just sort of being, told where to go on their phones.
Oh, I can imagine that. I was reading the story yesterday about Robert Louis Stevenson. He traveled quite a lot in the years before his death, his very untimely death. He was very young. He died at the age of 44. But he'd settled in Samoa and he died there uh, 5 years before the land was partitioned between Germany and the United States. But he traveled a lot and then settled there. And I couldn't help but think about, while I was reading about him, your story about Spillville. Although no one has died there, but this Czech composer, is it Dvorak,
Dvorak.
found a very hospitable place there for himself. Can you talk about that great story?
Sure. As you've said, in the summer of 1893, the Czech composer Antonin Dvorak, who was living in New York City at the time, was looking for a place to recharge his batteries. And, his secretary suggested, why don't you go out to this frontier town in Iowa where a bunch of Czech immigrants have settled from Bohemia? And he said, you know what, that's a great idea. So he took the train out in 1893 to, what was then sort of the very undeveloped northeastern corner of Iowa. And he had a wonderful summer composing something called the American Quartet. And so 125 years after that summer, I went to Spillville to get a sense of what northeastern Iowa was thinking about immigrants, such as the Czech settlers of Spillville had been, newcomers to America who didn't speak the language, who were in here for the economic opportunity and to raise their families and so forth. And northeastern Iowa, although far from our southern border, still has a number of Spanish-speaking immigrants, and it's tied to the pork business as well as packing houses. And I found a complicated story. There was certainly Trumpist nativism going on.
Hmm.
It's not hard to find. But, there was also a sense of our economy is going to freeze up if we don't have people to come here and do the work. A lot of this work that Americans just don't want to do, minding hogs and slaughtering animals in a packing house, which is tremendously hard labor.
Mm-hmm.
And so, there's an American schizophrenia about immigration that lives on in this town that Dvorak had spent his time in.
It's a wonderful essay. I hope everybody gets a chance to read it. I just learned so much about Dvorak. I've heard the music before, I've heard the name before, and I just didn't know the story. It's a gem. It's a gem in the book. I want to ask you about the final essay in the book. I found it so profound and poignant. The title is "At the End There Will Be Strangers." And while all along we've been traversing all these spaces and places in this book, now we come to a place that we can only truly understand, not through going there or researching, but through your own connection to it. And yet, the themes of the piece are just as universal as they can be. I was thinking about my own grandmother, for instance. Your grandmother's experiences, they are like those of many of our grandmothers and mothers who experienced a loss in a certain era for their generation, and then were driven to a particular kind of self-reliance. So I really admired learning about your grandmother. But then it's really about the space, again, the geography, at a very particular time now, that's more recent, and that house, the house. Can you talk about that essay a little bit?
Sure. Back to geography. I mean, we have, I think most families in the United States have a little postage stamp of ancestral geography, a place where their parents, their grandparents, or perhaps even many generations back had a house and land if they were involved in farming. And, those of us in the later generations, may or may not have a relationship with that piece of land. I happened to, have obviously visited my grandma many times, and this piece of, what was then considered, when they built the house, worthless dirt in a Phoenix suburb, had since sort of become the very snooty, high income, suburb with golf courses and McMansions, and our, working class family didn't get to participate in that at all. The house was very modest. My grandma was a lifelong civil servant of the state of Arizona, and so it comes the time when grandma passes on, and we sell the house, sell the land, and down comes the house. It was, in real estate parlance, a teardown. And so, some listeners may have had this sort of experience or even choice. If you know when the house is going to be torn down, do you go watch it? And I was really, really torn. It was going to be painful. Who wants to see that? This is a house that I had, memories of since I was a toddler. Do I really want to see it destroyed in the name of some rich person's McMansion? I finally decided that I should go, to be almost a representative of the family there at the very end. And it was a miserable experience. Just so sad, and a reminder of mortality, a reminder of how we don't own anything on this earth. We're renters. We have such a short lifespan. We're in between two yawning unknowns: the time before we were born and the time after we die. What happens? And we're left sometimes with contemplating the shells of what stands and what has remained of those people that we loved. And so, as I say, it was horrible. I wouldn't ever want to do it again, but I'm glad I did it.
Mm-hmm. I feel like the experience was made slightly worse by the person who purchased the property.
You're right. He was callous, totally indifferent, said several things that were so tone deaf. He said, "Yeah, we really want to experience all the amenities that you guys have enjoyed here." And I thought, you know what? Amenities is like a stupid real estate word, first of all. It's meant for brochures. And also, this was my family's house, and we were poor, and we didn't have any quote unquote amenities. What are you talking about? And a couple other, extremely stupid things that he said that made me just want to stay away from him and not ever say another word.
Oh, he sounded just terrible. And I found, maybe it's not ironic, but I just, the detail about the fact that he's involved with these memory care centers that people who need compassion rely on. It was just
Yeah,
a very,
that was an irony. You
oh,
can't make this stuff up.
you
The
can't.
family made their money in facilities which are dedicated to caring for people with dementia and Alzheimer's, and
Yeah.
preserving what's left of that memory. And here this guy is knocking down my memories. Not that, look, he bought the land fair and square. There was nothing like illegal about it, but at the same time, it was done so callously.
Well, but reading that story, um, all of the people in your family just came alive. Your uncle, your Aunt Diane, your grandmother. I mean, it is just such a gorgeous essay. Just unforgettable. Just an unforgettable essay.
Thank you. Thank you. That gratifies me to hear that.
Well, Tom, you were a reporter for many years, and you're an academic teaching at Chapman University.
Hmm.
But you're also the politics editor for the Los Angeles Review of Books. So, in your tenure in this role as politics editor, what have you found to be instructive in terms of books or your own research for us now in 2021 to know as a nation, not looking back at the last 4 years, but looking forward? What's been instructive for you? And I don't mean like the title of a book or an author's name, but just in all of that work that you do in this particular context. What's something that we need to know moving forward, do you think?
That's a great question. And I'll say that I am an optimist. I think the book under discussion here is an optimistic work, not only a celebration of the American land, but also of American perseverance in the face of huge challenges. Um, I think that political liberals such as myself need to re-embrace patriotism as a virtue and stop being embarrassed about love for the country. Um, January 6th was a huge, I think, shock to the conscience of all of us who assumed that the Constitution was this transcendent document that would always stand. It's far more vulnerable than that, and it does require the vigilance of patriots, which is another word that's been completely hijacked and twisted for us to, do our duty as citizens. There is an authoritarian threat. There is a threat from the pulling apart of the United States, such as George Packer wrote in his great book, The Unwinding, the way that the rich and privileged have become more and more separate from the working poor, from the middle class, and that there is a disintegration of shared mission. And, in some ways, an artificial conflict that's been ginned up by partisan media and the destruction of newspapers, as we talked about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
But also there is a very real sense of an economy that's leaving people behind, and leaving them to reach for extreme solutions, which is a horrible idea.
Well, it's an unfair question, I think, to ask you. Can America ever really recover from what divides it? I mean, these disparities that you talk about, these fractured systems. There's such a brokenness that's so palpable. I don't know. Maybe now more than ever, or maybe everything is relative, but it feels pretty bad right now. But there is something about that optimism that I really see in this book, and I really saw it. I grabbed onto that idea with the very first essay, and I sort of walk with this idea as I read the rest of the book. So the essay, Your Land, there's something about, there's these words from the Woody Guthrie song, this idea of the landscape being democratized for us. I mean, that can be a problematic thing to think about. But if you look at it from another standpoint, yes, we have this painful history. Our nation forged on slavery, for instance. But this first essay seems to walk us all in at least to the possibility and potential of the spaces in this country that we can discover simply because we are free to travel. I mean, not during the pandemic time, of course, but we are free to go to Spillville. We are free to go to these places. And some of these places have painful, painful histories that are palpable even still today. But there's this idea, this historian's chestnut that you mentioned, that geography is destiny. I just found something so hopeful in that first essay that, even some of the things that I encountered later on in some of the subsequent essays, I carried this idea with me. So I'm very happy to hear what you're saying about, looking into the future and sort of, we've identified so many issues as a nation where I think we're coming clean on some of them if we can. And, some of these other things are sort of on notice now. I don't know. I like this idea that you mentioned about not to be embarrassed about being patriotic and loving your country. There's a lot to love. And there's something about your book that reminds us of that. I mean, there's a hearkening back here to simpler times and some of these storefronts and some of these places that you visited that maybe might not be there anymore for us. But there's still other things, right? I just feel like it's a changing America, but it's still very much America. I mean, I don't want to sound so corny about it, but I just feel like there's still something very hopeful about where this book takes us.
Thank you. And you're absolutely right that we have many shameful elements of our history. And the Constitution was a document that had carried the assumption of slavery, the infamous Three-Fifths Compromise being a notorious example,
Mm-hmm.
and a constitution that required many amendments and a civil war to correct some of its flaws. And constitutional correction still goes on, but we should never lose sight of the fact that, particularly in its historical context, it was a magical, sacred document with a brilliant idea at its core. And I am fully in agreement with those who see the brutalities, the really disgusting inequalities in our past. But I want us to redeem that part of it, which is, sorry to repurpose a Reaganite phrase, but a city on a hill. You know, um, Not to get too deep into the last 4 years, but that was, I think, a really incalculable blow that this country took. That our moral authority was kind of squandered in terms of our ability to be an example for other nations about peaceful transfers of power, about guardrails against autocracy,
Mm-hmm.
about a certain morality in our dealings with not only ourselves, but with other nations. America's been terribly imperfect, but it still had a kind of a North Star to remind us of these things. It still does, although under challenge.
That same essay mentions the COVID-19 pandemic and this idea that travel for Americans will be further curbed. Americans like to think that, as you say in the essay, we have always been about motion and movement, climbing and ascending, exploring and discovering. But you offer the statistic that 1 of every 5 Americans changed their address in 1950, and today the figure's more like 1 in 9. I was
Mm-hmm.
surprised at that. And I'm thinking the slowdown was happening pre-pandemic, but yes, the pandemic's not helping that matter. How do you think the pandemic will affect your own wanderlust and your other research pursuits? Because it's from reading the book, it seems to me like you're not a guy who's on the phone all the time and Googling stuff. You travel to places, you shake people's hands, and you talk to them in person, and you go into their houses and sit at their tables. What are the paradigm shifts in your research about now, do you think?
That's a great question. I don't leave the house. I take COVID seriously. Not just for my own family's safety, but I, would dread the thought that I'm getting someone else sick. So, this is necessary precautions. I think of during World War II, the citizen sacrifices that our grandparents, great grandparents made, joining the Civil Air Patrol, doing without certain kinds of foods, not getting their tires changed,
Mm.
a sense of motivation to get through it, not keeping their lights on at night if they lived on the coast. These things were social expectations. And now we have these ridiculous, arguments about freedom, about this extremely easy, basic thing to do is just wear a mask. That creates such a sense of, you know, what's the word? Disappointment,
Yeah.
and your neighbors. Like, do you care so little about people that, your freedom to go around breathing during a pandemic is somehow like more important than the life of your 80-year-old neighbor? All that. But the question you asked about is about travel. Yes, I can't wait to get back on the road.
Tom Zoellner, thank you so much for talking to me today. I really appreciate it.
It's been a great conversation. Thank you.
Tom Zoellner is the author of The National Road, Dispatches from a Changing America. This has been Book Public from Texas Public Radio. Write to us at bookpublic@tpr.org. Jacob Rosati composed our theme music. Bree Kirkham is our digital producer. Dan Katz is Texas Public Radio's news director. I'm Yvette Benavides.